The sun was sliding down behind the dusty hills when the small border town gathered around, the wooden stage in the center of the square. People whispered, pointed, and stared as two rough men dragged a young woman forward, her hands tied and her clothes torn from struggle. She walked with her chin up, refusing to show fear. Even though her legs shook with every step, no one in town had seen a captive like her before. Her long black hair was tangled from running through the desert. Her skin carried marks of travel and hardship, and her dark eyes burned with fire instead of fear to the townsfolk. She looked like a trapped animal who would rather bite than surrender. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said she was a thief. Others claimed she belonged to a hostile tribe. And a few whispered that she was innocent and unlucky, but nobody knew the truth except her. At the edge of the crowd stood a cowboy named Luke Harland, a quiet rancher who rarely involved himself in other people's affairs. He had spent the whole day delivering cattle outside town and only stopped by to buy feed before heading home. But when he heard the commotion and saw the crowd gathering, something pulled him in. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The sheriff stood on the platform, shouting for silence as he held up a folded paper with shaky hands. This woman, the sheriff began, was captured near the canyon after running from a wagon belonging to these two men, he said. Pointing at the captors, he continued reading the accusations. But Luke noticed the girl wasn't listening at all. Her eyes wandered across the crowd, studying every face, measuring every distance like someone planning an escape, even with ropes on her wrists. Luke had seen fear before, but this was not fear. This was defiance, pure and burning. She looked like someone who had already made peace with death, if death meant freedom. The sheriff cleared his throat loudly. Since the accused refuses to speak or defend herself, she will be sold as property to repay the men's claimed losses. The crowd murmured at the word sold. Some were disgusted, some curious, but none of them stepped in. To them, she was a stranger, just another hard story in a harsh land. Luke felt something twist inside his chest. He didn't know her, but something about her expression hooked him. It wasn't her beauty, though she had an unusual, fierce kind of beauty. It was the way she carried herself, like the world had tried to break her 1,000 times and failed every single time. The bidding began with loud voices and cruel comments. The two captors smirked proudly, sure they would earn a good amount. But then the girl did something no one expected. She lifted her head and shouted in a clear voice, "I'd rather die." The words sliced through the air like a blade. The square went silent. Even the men holding her paused for a moment. Luke felt a chill run down his spine. Her voice wasn't weak or desperate. It was steady, sharp, and full of pride. She looked at the crowd like she was daring them to try and break her spirit. One of the bidders laughed nervously. Another stepped back, unsure if they even wanted her anymore. The sheriff looked frustrated, tapping his boots on the stage. "This is not your choice," he snapped at her. But she kept staring forward, unblinking. Luke realized she didn't just say those words out of fear. She meant them if they pushed her too far. She would find a way to end it herself. Even in chains, the captors shoved her again. Annoyed by her resistance, she stumbled but refused to kneel. Luke stepped forward without even realizing his feet had moved. Before he knew it, he was standing near the front of the crowd. Staring up at the stage, he didn't understand why he felt pulled toward her story. Maybe it was because he had lived long enough to recognize unfairness. Maybe it was because something in her eyes reminded him of someone he used to know. Or maybe he was just tired of watching cruelty happen right in front of him. The sheriff started the bidding again. But most people stayed silent. The girl's words had spooked them. You couldn't force courage like that into a cage. Finally, one man muttered, "Not worth the trouble," and walked away. Luke took a deep breath, realizing he was about to do something he hadn't planned. something reckless, something dangerous. He raised his hand slightly. $3, he said, his voice calm but firm. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $3 was an insultingly low offer. The captors stepped forward angrily, but the sheriff merely looked tired. "No one else is bidding," he said quietly. $3 it is. The girl turned her head sharply toward Luke. Her expression unreadable. She didn't look grateful. She didn't look relieved. She looked confused, like she was trying to understand why a stranger had stepped in with such a small offer. The ropes were cut, and she was pushed toward Luke, stumbling at first but catching herself quickly. Luke stood still, letting her approach without reaching for her. He knew better than to grab someone who had spent days fighting for freedom. She stopped a few feet away from him, breathing hard. Her eyes filled with suspicion and exhaustion. Luke spoke gently. "You're safe now." She narrowed her eyes, studying him for any hint of a lie. But she didn't respond. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like she wasn't sure whether she should run, fight, or collapse. Luke removed his hat and nodded slowly. "I don't own you," he said softly. "You can walk away if you want." Her lips parted, surprised. No one in the square had expected those words. Not even Luke himself. Her eyes softened for the first time. Just a little, but her voice remained firm. "You paid $3 for me," she said. Why? Luke didn't have an answer, not one he could put into words yet. He simply said, no one should face death alone. And for the first time since her capture. The girl looked away from the ground, not at the crowd. Not at the captors, but at the road leading far away from that cruel little town. A road neither of them knew they would walk together. A road that would change both of their lives forever. Luke led the young woman away from the noisy square, keeping a respectful distance between them. He didn't touch her or pull her forward. He simply walked beside her, slowly, giving her time to breathe after everything she had faced. She kept glancing around, watching every doorway, every shadow. Every man who passed by, her body was tense like a wild horse ready to bolt. Luke understood that look well. He had spent years around animals that trusted no one. Humans included. The difference was that this woman was not an animal. She was someone who had been pushed to her limits and still refused to break. When they reached the outskirts of town, Luke stopped near a water trough and pointed to it gently. "You need a drink," he said. She hesitated, watching him as if expecting a trick, but when she saw he wasn't moving any closer, she bent down and cupped the cold water in her hands. She drank quickly, almost desperately, until her breathing slowed and her hands stopped shaking. Luke waited until she had finished before he spoke again. "I'm going back to my ranch," he said quietly. "It's a long ride, and night is coming. You can come with me for safety, or you can choose your own road." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her dark eyes fixed on him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "No one helps for free," she said sharply. Luke nodded, understanding her suspicion. "Maybe," he said, "but not everyone helps for a price either." She looked away, unconvinced, her jaw tightening as she crossed her arms. He could see she was exhausted but still fighting any hint of vulnerability. "What's your name?" Luke asked softly. She didn't answer. He didn't push her. "Mine is Luke," he added quietly. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "My name doesn't belong to anyone," she whispered. "Not anymore." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. But she forced it steady again. Luke saw the pain behind her defiance. A wound deeper than anything visible on her skin. He motioned toward his horse, a calm chestnut gelding that stood patiently near the fence. "He's gentle," Luke said. "He won't throw you." She stepped back instantly, shaking her head. "I walk," she insisted. "It's 20 miles, Luke reminded her. "I still walk," she repeated firmly. Luke sighed, respecting her choice. "All right," he said. "I'll walk too." That made her look at him with confusion again. "You would walk 20 miles because of me?" she asked. Luke shrugged lightly. "It wouldn't be right to leave you alone on the road after what you've been through," he said. "And I don't ride while someone beside me has to walk." She stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand the kind of man he was. Finally, she lifted her chin and stepped toward the horse. "I will ride," she said quietly. "But only because I cannot fight the night in this condition." Luke gave her a small nod. He helped her mount carefully without touching her more than necessary. She settled into the saddle awkwardly at first. Gripping the horn tightly, Luke began walking beside the horse, leading them toward the wide-open road ahead. For a long time, they moved in silence, the sky turning deep orange and purple as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The cool wind brushed against them, carrying the smell of sage and dust. After nearly an hour, the woman finally broke the silence. "Why did you pay for me?" she asked again, her voice steady but curious. Luke hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because I didn't like the way they looked at you," he said. "Like you were less than human." She didn't speak for a moment, and Luke wondered if his answer made her angry. But instead, she said, "No man has ever stepped between me and danger without wanting something in return." Luke kicked a small stone away from his path, his face unreadable. "I don't want anything," he said gently. "Not even my story?" she asked sharply. Luke glanced up at her. "If you want to tell it, I'll listen," he said. "If you don't, then we ride in silence." "That's your choice." Her shoulders loosened a little, like a weight had shifted. Choice was something she hadn't had in a long time. For the first time since they left the town, she looked less like a prisoner and more like a person. As the night deepened, Luke pulled out a small lantern from his saddlebag and lit it. Letting its warm glow guide their path, the desert air grew colder, and the distant howl of coyotes echoed across the open land. The woman shivered slightly, though she tried to hide it. Luke noticed and stopped walking. He removed his long coat without a word and held it up toward her. She frowned, refusing. "You need it?" she said. "I've lived out here all my life," he replied calmly. "I'll be fine." Reluctantly, she took the coat, clutching it around herself as the warm fabric shielded her from the night chill. After another mile, she spoke again, this time softer. "My name is Mara," she said. Luke looked up at her with a small, respectful nod. "Mara," he repeated gently. She seemed to be testing how it sounded in someone else's voice. And when Luke said it, she didn't flinch or pull away. She allowed the moment to exist, even if just for a breath. As they neared the first canyon pass, the moon rose high, glowing silver over the rocks. Mara looked around uneasily. "This place?" she murmured. "I know it." Luke slowed his steps. "From before?" he asked. "From when they chased me," she whispered, tightening her grip on the reins. "I escaped into these rocks, but they caught me before sunrise." Luke felt something cold settle in his chest. He didn't know everything yet, but he knew enough to understand she had suffered more than any person should. "We're not stopping here," he said firmly. "We'll keep going until we're past their tracks." Mara looked down at him, her face lit by moonlight and lantern glow for the first time. Trust flickered in her eyes, faint but real. "You speak like someone who keeps his word," she whispered. Luke met her gaze. "I try to," he said gently. Together they continued through the night, he walking, she riding, both of them stepping into a future neither one expected. And though she didn't say it aloud, Mara began to feel something she hadn't felt in weeks, the smallest spark of safety. A spark she didn't want to believe in yet, but one she couldn't ignore. The night grew quieter as Luke and Mara moved deeper into the valley. The lantern swung softly in Luke's hand, casting long shadows on the rocky path. Mara kept her back straight in the saddle, but her eyes moved from side to side, alert to every sound. She was used to danger following her, and she did not trust silence to her. Silence was the moment before something terrible happened. Luke noticed the tension in her shoulders. But he didn't rush her with questions. He let the night speak for them. He knew that people who had survived fear needed time before they shared their truth, but after another hour of steady travel, Mara finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost carried away by the cold wind. "Do you know why I said I'd rather die?" she asked. Luke slowed his steps, keeping his eyes on the narrow path. "I figured you had a good reason," he answered quietly. She gave a dry, humorless laugh. "Good reason," she repeated. "There is never a good reason for wanting to die." Luke looked up at her, the lantern lighting her face. "But wanting freedom," he said. "That is a reason I understand." Mara looked down, meeting his eyes for a moment. Something softened inside her before she looked away again. "I wasn't afraid of being sold," she whispered. "I was afraid of losing myself." Luke didn't answer. He knew enough to let her continue when she was ready. And after a long pause, she continued. "When those men caught me, they treated me like I was nothing," she said, "like the world owned me, like my life didn't belong to me anymore." She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the coat around her tightly. "So when the sheriff said I had no choice, that I couldn't speak, that I couldn't defend myself," she whispered, "I thought then, I don't want to live in such a world." Luke felt a tightness in his chest. Not anger at her, but at what she had been forced to endure. "That crowd," Mara continued, "they stared at me like I was some object they could pass around." Her voice trembled with controlled emotion. "So I said I'd rather die than let them break what little I still had left." Luke nodded slowly. "And you were willing to keep that promise," he said quietly. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. Luke breathed deeply before speaking again. "When you shouted it," he said, "everyone froze." "I wanted them to," Mara replied sharply. "I wanted them to see me." Not what they imagined. Luke walked a little closer to the horse, his voice steady. "And I saw you," he said. "Not a captive, not a problem, just someone standing alone against a whole crowd." Mara blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Most men would have seen a burden," she whispered. "Maybe," Luke replied. "But I've carried heavier things in my life." The horse snorted softly, and Mara reached down to steady herself. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting the wind brush against her face. "When you said $3, she said, "I thought you were mocking me." Luke stopped walking for a moment, the lantern swinging as he turned to her. "I wasn't mocking you," he said gently. "I was mocking them." Mara's eyes widened a little. "Mocking the men who thought they could put a price on a person," Luke continued. "A price on you for the first time." Mara's lips lifted slightly. Not exactly a smile, but close to one. "It made them angry," she said quietly. "It was supposed to," Luke replied. "You're braver than you look," she said. Her voice softening, Luke chuckled under his breath. "I could say the same about you," he answered. They reached a narrow pass between two tall rock walls, and Luke lifted the lantern higher to guide the horse. Mara leaned forward slightly, her eyes following the shadows on the stone. "This place," she murmured, "it feels like a memory." Luke listened carefully. "Mara," he said gently, "did something happen here?" She hesitated, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "They chased me through these rocks," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I ran until my legs gave out." She looked down at her wrists, where faint rope marks still remained. "They tied me because I fought too hard," she whispered. Luke clenched his jaw, but he kept his voice calm. "Those men won't touch you again," he said firmly. Mara studied him for a long moment. "How can you be sure?" she asked. "Because I'm not leaving your side until I get you somewhere safe," he said. "That's a promise." Mara looked away, but her voice softened in a way it hadn't before. No one has ever promised me safety, she whispered. Luke gave a small nod. Then this can be the first time, he answered quietly. The moonlight spilled across the path as they continued forward, the horse's hooves tapping softly against the hard ground. Mara's breathing slowly calmed, and the sharp fear in her eyes faded to something gentler. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was closer than before. After another stretch of silence, Mara spoke again. When I shouted in the square, she said, I didn't expect anyone to understand. Luke looked up at her. I did, he said. I heard more than just anger in your voice. What did you hear? She asked quietly. Courage, Luke answered. Mara blinked again. As if she hadn't heard that word in years. Courage, she repeated softly. I felt like I was drowning. Luke shook his head gently. People drowning don't fight, he said. And you fought. A long silence settled between them. Not heavy, but thoughtful. Finally, Mara whispered, Maybe I fought because some small part of me hoped someone would see me. Luke's voice softened even more. I saw you, he said again. This time, she didn't look away. Her eyes stayed on him, steady and searching. Like she was trying to understand how a stranger could see her more clearly than people who had known her before. As they left the canyon behind, the open land stretched out again. Wide and endless, Luke lifted the lantern higher. Leading them slowly forward, Mara breathed deeply. Her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. For stopping the crowd, she said. Luke looked up at her and nodded. You stopped them? He said. I just stepped in afterward for the first time since he found her. Mara's face softened enough for a real emotion to show. Something fragile, something human, something almost like hope. And as they walked into the deeper night, both of them knew one thing without saying it. The moment she shouted, those words had changed everything. Not just the crowd, not just the bidding, but the path of two strangers whose lives were now tied together by a single act of defiance. A single cry that refused to be silenced. A single spark that neither one of them could ignore. The night deepened around them as Luke and Mara moved farther from town. They had left behind the narrow canyon walls and stepped into open land where the stars looked close enough to touch. Mara sat quietly in the saddle, but Luke could tell her mind was not quiet at all. He could almost feel the storm of questions inside her. Finally, after another mile, she spoke in a low voice. $3, she whispered. Why did it have to be 3? Luke glanced up at her. Surprised by the question, he had expected her to ask about the road, the dangers, or the ranch, but not that. What's wrong with 3? He asked softly. Mara wrapped his coat tighter around herself. Her eyes troubled. When you said that number, she said. It made everyone angry, angrier than I expected. Luke nodded slowly. Because $3 insulted them, he said. They wanted a high price, something to show power, he added. But I showed the opposite. Mara looked down at him. Her expression mixed with confusion and something deeper. So you did it on purpose, she asked. To shame them? Luke replied calmly. To make them feel small for trying to sell a person, Mara inhaled sharply. They didn't care about me, she said. They only cared about losing money. Luke nodded again. They never saw you as a person, he said quietly. Just something they could trade. Mara lowered her gaze. Her voice almost a whisper. And the crowd? She asked. Were they angry too? Luke thought for a moment. Yes, he said. Angry because I reminded them what they were doing. Mara stared ahead into the desert. It felt strange, she murmured. All those people shouting, but when you said $3. Everything stopped. Luke remembered the scene clearly, the shock on their faces. The captor's fury, the sheriff's discomfort. It wasn't the amount, Luke said gently. It was the message. Mara frowned. What message? She asked. That their greed meant nothing, Luke answered. And your life couldn't be priced. The wind picked up slightly, blowing strands of her hair across her cheek. She brushed them back slowly, thinking about his words. "I thought you were making fun of me," she admitted softly. "No," Luke said. "I was making fun of them." Another long silence followed, but this one felt calmer. Luke guided the horse around a dry patch of thorn bushes and continued walking beside her. The moonlight reflected off the sandy ground, making their shadows appear long and stretched. Mara watched the shadow of Luke beside her, steady and dependable. $3, she whispered again. "I don't know why that number stays in my head." Luke gave a small smile. "Because it changed your life," he said. "Even if you didn't want it to." Mara let out a slow breath. "I didn't think anyone would ever defend me," she said. "Not after what happened." Luke looked up at her, his face serious but gentle. "You don't have to tell me what happened," he said quietly. "Not until you want to." Mara tightened her grip on the reins. "Want?" she whispered. "I haven't wanted anything in a long time." Luke's voice remained steady. "Maybe that will change," he said, one step at a time. They walked until the sky turned even darker, the stars growing brighter above them. Mara shifted slightly in the saddle, wincing softly. Luke noticed the discomfort instantly. "You're hurt," he said. Mara shook her head quickly. "It's nothing," she said. "I've had worse." Luke frowned. "Pain is still pain," he replied. She did not answer, but her silence told him enough. They stopped near a cluster of tall rocks that offered some shelter from the night wind. Luke set down the lantern on a flat stone and took out a small leather pouch. "What are you doing?" Mara asked. "Checking your wounds," Luke said simply. Mara stiffened, pulling his coat tighter. "You don't need to do that," she muttered. "I know," Luke said gently. "But I want to help." Her eyes softened for a moment. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." Luke opened the pouch and took out a wrapped cloth. "Because someone once helped me when I had no one," he said quietly. Mara watched him, curiosity flickering in her expression. "What happened to you?" she asked. Luke shook his head. "That story is for another night," he said. "Tonight is about you." Mara swallowed slowly. Her defenses were slipping, little by little. Not because she forced them down, but because Luke gave her no reason to hold them so tightly. "Fine," she whispered, "but I can do it myself." She tried to move her leg, but pain shot through her body and she gasped sharply. Luke reached out instinctively, but stopped his hand before touching her. "You need rest," he said. "We'll stop here for a while." Mara hesitated, then nodded. Luke guided the horse closer to the rock wall and helped her dismount. She stumbled slightly, and for the first time, she allowed Luke to steady her. His hands were gentle, respectful, giving support without force. She stood with her back against the rock. "Breathing deeply, you're safe here," Luke said softly. Mara closed her eyes at those words. Safe, such a simple word, but one she had not heard in so long. After a moment, she opened her eyes again. $3, she said quietly. "They hated you for it?" Luke nodded. Settling down on a flat stone, "I know," he admitted. "But their hate doesn't matter." "Why not?" she asked. "Because one life is worth more than their anger," he answered. Mara stared at him in silence, her eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "And you believe that?" she whispered. "Every word," Luke said calmly. Something shifted inside her, something small, but real. Maybe trust, maybe hope. Maybe the beginning of healing, she wasn't sure yet. But she knew one thing. Luke wasn't lying. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't like the men she had escaped from. She looked up at the stars and breathed softly. For the first time, she whispered, "I'm glad someone paid $3. Luke looked at her gently, and for the first time, he said, "Those $3 meant something," and under the desert sky, with the cold wind softening around them, the spark that began in the town square grew just a little brighter. A spark born from defiance, danger, and $3 that no one expected to matter. But somehow changed everything, for both of them, one quiet mile at a time. The night grew colder as Luke and Mara rested against the tall rocks. The lantern's glow flickered with every gust of wind, making shadows stretch and pull across the sandy ground. Mara pulled Luke's coat tighter around herself, feeling its warmth settle into her skin. It was strange for her, a coat, a quiet night, and a man who wasn't trying to control her. She wasn't used to kindness. Kindness always came with a price in her past. But Luke didn't ask for anything. He didn't demand answers. Didn't push her to trust him. Didn't try to own her. He simply sat near her, silent and steady, as if his presence alone was his promise of protection. "Are you ready to move again?" Luke asked softly after some time. Mara looked at the sky, seeing clouds drifting closer. "How far is your ranch?" she asked. "Another 10 miles?" Luke said. "Maybe less if we cut across the plains." Mara nodded slowly. "I can ride," she said. "I don't want to stop too long in one place." Luke understood the fear behind those words. Staying still meant being found. It meant danger creeping up from the dark. "All right," he said gently. "Let's keep going." He helped her mount the horse again, careful and respectful. This time, Mara didn't flinch at his touch, her body still tense. But not from fear more, from lingering pain and exhaustion. Luke took the reins and began walking beside her once more. His steps steady, his voice calm. "We'll avoid the main trail," he said. "Too many tracks for those men to follow." Mara nodded silently. She trusted his judgment more than her own right now. They moved across the open plains, where tall, dry grass brushed against Luke's legs and the horse's sides. The moon disappeared behind clouds, leaving only the lantern and stars to guide them. Mara listened closely to every sound: the wind, the horse's breathing, Luke's steady footsteps, for the first time in days. She didn't feel hunted, not completely safe, but not helpless either. "Luke," she said quietly. "Yes," he answered without looking up. "People don't fight for strangers," she said. "Not like you did." Luke walked a little slower, thinking before he replied. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I wasn't fighting for a stranger." Mara's eyebrows lowered. "You didn't know me," she said. "I didn't need to," Luke replied. "I knew what was happening wasn't right." Mara looked down at him, confusion mixing with something gentler. "You speak like a man who lost something," she whispered. Luke didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened slightly, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "Everyone loses something," he said quietly. "What matters is what you do afterward." Mara didn't push him for more, but she remembered the sadness in his voice. Maybe he wasn't saving her, she thought. Maybe he was trying to save a part of himself too. Hours passed slowly, the darkness growing deeper as clouds thickened overhead. Mara shivered again despite the coat. Luke noticed instantly. "We should build a small fire," he said. "Just enough for warmth." "No," Mara said sharply. "Fire means light. And light means they can find us." Luke stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Mara," he said, "those men won't track us in this darkness." "You don't know them," she said, her voice tightening. "They are hunters. They don't stop." Luke studied her face, the fear she tried to hide. "All right," he said softly. "No fire." They continued forward, the wind growing colder, the clouds growing thicker. Mara gripped the saddle horn tightly, her breath shaky. "Tell me something," Luke said gently, wanting to distract her from the cold. "What?" she asked. "Something from before," he said. "Anything you want to share?" Mara hesitated. Her past was a wound she kept covered, but the night, the loneliness. The slow footsteps beside her, it all made her feel less alone than she had felt in years. "Before I was taken," she whispered, "I lived near the river plains." Luke listened quietly. "I worked with my hands," she continued. "I made things with leather, small things, belts, straps, bags." Her voice grew softer. "I wasn't rich, but I was free." The word free trembled in her mouth like something painful. "And then," she whispered, "everything changed." Luke looked up at her. "You don't have to say more," he said gently. Mara shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I need to say it." She took a slow breath. "There was a wagon that passed near my land," she said. "Two men asked for water. They looked harmless." Her hands tightened around the reins. "But when I turned my back, they grabbed me." Luke felt his stomach twist. But he stayed silent. "I fought," Mara continued. "I fought until I couldn't breathe. I bit one of them, scratched the other, kicked, screamed." Her eyes filled with fire. "I made them bleed," she whispered, pride flickering for a moment. "But they tied me anyway and threw me into the wagon." Luke exhaled slowly. Those men weren't hunters, he realized. They were cowards. Cowards who used force instead of courage. "They thought I would break," Mara murmured. "But I didn't." Luke nodded. "I know," he said softly. "I saw that in the town square." Mara looked down at him. "Why didn't you look away like the others?" she asked. Luke's voice was steady. "Because I've lived long enough to know that sometimes all a person needs is one person who refuses to look away." Mara's throat tightened. Her eyes softened in a way Luke hadn't seen before. "Luke," she whispered, "I don't know why, but I feel like I can breathe when you're near." Luke didn't smile, didn't blush, didn't change his expression. He simply said, "Good. Everyone deserves a place where they can breathe." They continued traveling into the night. The lantern flickered as the wind grew colder. But the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt warm-like to people walking through darkness together. Not as strangers, not as captor and freed captive, but as something new, something fragile but real. The road ahead was long and filled with danger, but neither of them turned back. Not Mara, who had survived too much to give up, and not Luke, who had silently taken responsibility for her safety the moment he said $3. Mara looked ahead into the darkness and whispered, "Wherever this road leads. I am not walking it alone." Luke glanced up at her. His voice soft. "Not anymore," he said. And with those words, they rode deeper into the unknown. Two souls carrying scars, two hearts learning to trust. Two strangers beginning a journey neither had expected. But both were meant to walk together, one quiet mile at a time. The night settled heavier around them as Luke and Mara continued through the plains. Clouds thickened above, blocking the moon completely, leaving the desert in deep darkness. The lantern's glow was now their only guide, a soft golden circle moving with each step. Mara held the saddle horn tightly, her fingers stiff from the cold. Luke noticed her shivering and slowed his pace. "We'll reach a small abandoned shed soon," he said. "It will give us shelter for a bit." Mara nodded. But she didn't look convinced. Her mind was drifting again, trapped between fear and memories she didn't want to revisit. Luke glanced up at her. "You're quieter than before," he said gently. Mara didn't reply immediately. "It's easier to stay quiet," she whispered. "Words can hurt more than silence sometimes." Luke understood. He had carried his own silent years long before he ever met her. "You don't have to talk," he said. "Not unless you want to." Mara looked down at him, her eyes soft but guarded. "But you want to know," she said. Luke shook his head. "I want you safe," he replied. "That matters more than your past." They kept moving until Luke pointed ahead at a small wooden structure near a cluster of boulders. "That's the shed," he said. "We'll rest there." Mara studied the dark shape in the distance. "It looks abandoned," she said. "It is," Luke replied, "but the roof is strong, and it will keep the wind off." When they reached the shed, Luke opened the old wooden door carefully, making sure nothing dangerous waited inside. The place was dusty, with broken crates scattered in the corners. A single wooden bench stood against the wall, half rotten but still usable. "It's not much," Luke said, "but it's better than the cold." Mara dismounted slowly. Wincing as her injured leg touched the ground, Luke stepped forward instantly, his hands ready to help, but not touching unless she allowed it. She steadied herself on the saddle for a moment before whispering, "Thank you," inside the shed. Luke set the lantern on a crate, filling the room with dim, warm light. Mara sat on the bench, pulling his coat tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the flame of the lantern. Her face distant, Luke leaned against the doorway, giving her space. "Something is bothering you," he said softly. Mara flinched slightly, caught off guard. She hesitated for a long moment before taking a slow breath. "Luke," she whispered. "There is something I haven't told you." Luke nodded gently. "You don't owe me explanations," he said. "Not for anything." Mara shook her head. "I owe myself the truth," she said quietly. She stared at her hands, trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "When those men caught me," she began. "It wasn't the first time someone tried." Luke's eyes darkened, but he stayed silent. "Mara," he said softly, inviting her to continue only if she wanted. Mara swallowed hard. "My village was attacked years ago," she whispered. "I survived, but many didn't." Luke felt something heavy settle in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Mara shook her head again. "Don't be," she whispered. Surviving was the curse. Luke frowned slightly. "Why do you say that?" he asked. Mara closed her eyes tightly. "Because every time I tried to build a life," she said, "someone tried to take it away." Her voice trembled. "I lost my home, my family, my land, and finally, even my name." Luke stepped inside the shed, slowly, stopping a few feet away from her. "You still have your name," he said. "You spoke it to me." Mara opened her eyes, pain shining in them. "But speaking it feels dangerous," she whispered. "Like holding a memory that could be stolen again." Luke's voice softened even more. "No one can steal what you hold in your heart," he said. "Not unless you give it away." Mara looked up at him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising, frustration breaking through her calm. Luke didn't flinch. "Then help me understand," he said gently. "Only if you choose." Mara pressed her hands to her face. Breathing shakily, "I fought everyone," she whispered. "I fought fate, men, fear itself, but I can't fight the past," she said. "It follows me everywhere." Luke crouched down slowly, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough for her to feel his steady presence. "Mara," he said softly, "you don't have to fight alone anymore." Her breath caught. She looked at him with disbelief in her eyes. "No one ever stays," she whispered. "Everyone leaves, or dies, or turns into someone cruel." Luke's expression didn't change. "Then this time will be different," he said softly. She stared at him, almost angry at how icily he said it. "How can you promise that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything," Luke said. "And I won't walk away from someone who's already been through too much." Mara's lips parted slightly. "You lost everything too," she whispered. Luke nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "But that's a story for another night." Mara lowered her gaze. For the first time, she didn't look like someone running. She looked like someone standing at the edge of a truth she had held inside for too long. Silence filled the shed, not heavy, but broken in small breaths. Finally, she whispered, "Luke." "I don't know how to trust," Luke answered softly. "You don't have to trust me today." He leaned his arm against the bench, his voice steady. "But you can trust the road," he said. Trust the journey. Trust the steps you choose. He paused. And trust yourself, Mara looked at him. A tear slipping down her cheek, she wiped it away quickly, as if ashamed. Luke pretended not to notice, giving her dignity. After a long silence, she whispered, "Will we reach your ranch by dawn?" Luke nodded. "If we leave soon," he said. "We'll be there before the sun climbs high." Mara stood slowly, her strength returning bit by bit. "Then let's go," she said. Luke lifted the lantern, opened the shed door, and stepped out into the cold night. Mara followed close behind for the first time. She didn't hesitate to walk beside him, and as they returned to the open plains, her past no longer felt like a chain around her. It still hurt, still scarred, still heavy. But now she wasn't carrying it alone, not anymore. The road stretched ahead, dark, uncertain, dangerous, but Mara whispered to herself, "Maybe the future is not as dark as the past," and Luke, hearing her quiet words, said softly, "One step at a time." Mara. Together, they stepped into the night. Not running, not hiding, but moving toward the life waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. A life where the past no longer controlled them, and where two broken souls could begin to heal, side by side, one breath at a time. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges when Luke and Mara left the abandoned shed behind. The air was cold enough to sting their skin, and the plains stretched wide and empty around them. Dawn was still far away, but the first hints of a new day glowed softly over the distant hills. Mara breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs as she settled again on the horse's back. Her body still ached, but her spirit felt different, lighter somehow. Talking in the shed had shaken her, but it had also released something inside her, a truth she had carried alone for too long. Luke walked beside the horse, the lantern now dim as the night slowly loosened its hold. "We'll reach the outskirts of my ranch soon," he said. "Once we're there, you can rest without fear." Mara nodded silently. "Luke," she whispered after a moment, "do you ever get tired of carrying other people's burdens?" Luke smiled faintly. "It's not a burden if someone needs help," he said. "And you needed help." Mara looked away, unsure how to answer. No one had ever spoken to her with such simple honesty. The clouds overhead shifted, revealing a pale slice of moon. Mara glanced up, her expression tightening suddenly. "Luke," she said sharply. "Stop." He froze instantly. "What is it?" he asked. Mara leaned forward in the saddle, her eyes scanning the horizon. "I hear something," she whispered. Luke listened carefully. At first, there was only the wind. Then, faint but growing, came the distant echo of hooves. Not one horse many, moving fast. Luke's jaw tightened. "They're behind us," Mara whispered, her voice trembling. They found the trail. Luke blew out a slow breath. "Steady but serious. They won't reach us if we stay ahead," he said. He tightened his grip on the reins and quickened his pace. But the sound of hooves was getting clearer. Closer, harder to ignore. Mara clutched the saddle horn, her knuckles white. "Luke," she whispered, "they're not just following. They're hunting." Luke glanced up at her. "I know," he said calmly. "But they're not taking you back." The horse began to move faster as Luke urged him forward. But Mara's heart beat even faster. She looked over her shoulder and saw shadows moving across the plains. Dark figures riding hard, closing the distance with frightening speed. Luke cursed under his breath. "There are more than I expected," he said. Mara swallowed hard. "They won't stop until they get me," she whispered. Luke stopped walking and grabbed the saddle horn to steady her, his voice deep and calm. "Mara, look at me." She looked down, her eyes wide with fear. "They will not touch you," Luke said firmly. "Not while I'm breathing." Mara sucked in a shaky breath. "But Luke." "You're one man," she whispered. Luke tightened the saddle straps quickly. "I'm one man," he said, "but I'm not afraid of them." He stepped closer to her. "And you're not alone anymore. Remember?" Mara blinked, fighting back tears she didn't want to show. Luke took the lantern and blew it out to hide their light. "Hold tight," he said. "We're riding fast." He mounted behind her, his movement quick and controlled. The horse felt the tension and stamped the ground, ready to run. Luke wrapped an arm around her waist knot to claim her. Not to control her, but to keep her steady as he took the reins. "You trust me?" he asked quietly. Mara hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." Luke dug his heels into the horse's sides, and the animal bolted forward. The plains blurred beneath them as they raced through the darkness. The wind whipped Mara's hair across her face as she clung to the saddle. Behind them, the riders shouted, their torches sparking light through the dark. Luke steered them toward the hills. "They can't follow well through rocky ground," he said. Mara nodded, forcing her fear down. "Luke," she whispered, "I don't want to be taken alive again." Luke's voice grew harder than she had ever heard. "They won't take you, Mara." The horse climbed the hillside, hooves clattering against stone. The riders struggled to follow, slipping on the uneven ground. Luke pushed the horse harder until they reached the top of the ridge. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. Below them stretched a long valley, and at the far end of it, faint but visible in the early light, a cluster of wooden fences and a small cabin. "My ranch," Luke said. Mara exhaled, her fear mixing with relief. "It's close," she whispered. "Yes," Luke said. "Just hold on." They started down the slope, the horse moving quickly but carefully. The riders reached the ridge behind them, their shouts echoing through the plains. Luke gritted his teeth. "They're desperate," he said. "They know once we reach the ranch, they're done." Mara looked back and saw one rider far ahead of the others. He was big, broad-shouldered, and riding fast. "It's him," she whispered in terror. "The one who tied me first." Luke looked back, his eyes turning cold. "Then he's the one who will regret coming here," he said. The horse galloped into the valley, rushing through tall grass as dawn began to brighten the sky. Luke guided him straight toward the ranch, closer and closer until they finally crashed through the wooden gate and skidded to a stop in front of the cabin. Luke jumped down first and pulled Mara gently to the ground. Inside, he said, "Go." Mara caught his arm, panic rising again. "What about you?" she asked. Luke placed his hand over hers, steady and firm. "I'll deal with them," he said. "This is my land." Mara shook her head. "They'll kill you," she whispered. Luke met her eyes. "They'll try," he said. "But I'm not leaving you." Mara hesitated for one breath, then ran into the cabin, her heart pounding. Luke stayed outside. Facing the direction of the incoming riders, he stood tall, his hand near his holster. Calm, steady, ready, the riders stormed into the valley. Shouting in rage, dust rose behind them like a storm. Mara watched from inside, trembling. Luke did not move. He stood alone against a group of armed men. Mara's breath caught when the leader roared, "Give her back or die." Luke's answer was quiet, "No." And as the sun finally pushed over the horizon, Mara realized something she had never believed in before. Someone was willing to fight for her. Not for money, not for advantage, but because she mattered. She pressed her hand against the cabin wall and whispered, "Please, Luke, stay alive," outside, facing down the men who stole her life. Luke whispered back into the cold morning air, "I won't let them take you." The past had come for her. But Luke stood between her and the darkness, ready to face whatever came next, even if it meant risking everything he had. For her, for the promise he made. For the woman who refused to break, and the woman he refused to lose. The riders thundered into the valley as the sun climbed over the ridge. Their shouts echoed across the plains, growing louder with each passing second inside the cabin. Mara pressed her back against the wooden wall, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the unbearable thought of losing the one man who had stood for her when no one else dared. Outside, Luke stood tall in the open yard, facing the dust and chaos rushing toward him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't step back. He looked like a mountain rooted in the earth, solid and unbreakable. Mara's breath trembled as she watched him through the narrow window. She whispered his name under her breath, as if the sound alone could shield him. The riders pulled their horses to a hard stop, dust swirling around them. The leader, a thick-set man with cruel eyes, pointed at Luke with hatred burning in his stare. "That girl is ours," he growled. "You paid $3, cowboy. But she ain't worth your life." Luke rested his hand calmly on his holster. "She's not yours," he said in an even tone. "And she's not for sale," the other men muttered. Shifting restlessly on their saddles, they hadn't expected Luke to stand his ground. They certainly hadn't expected him to stand alone. The leader spat on the ground and stepped forward. "You think one man can stop all of us?" he snarled. Luke's voice barely rose, but every word carried across the yard. "I think the truth can." Mara watched the scene with her heart in her throat. The men laughed harshly at Luke's calm words. "What truth?" the leader demanded. Luke lifted his gaze. "That she fought you," he said. "That she said no. That she chose her freedom." Mara felt a jolt go through her. He wasn't defending her body. He was defending her choice, her dignity, her voice. One of the men grew angry and drew his pistol. Luke didn't move. Inside the cabin, Mara gasped, pressing her hand against the glass, but before the man could fire, the leader lifted his hand, stopping him. "Put that away," he growled. "I want the girl alive." His eyes narrowed at Luke. "You can walk away, cowboy. And we won't chase you." Luke shook his head slowly. "I'm not walking away from her," he said. "Not now. Not ever." Mara's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said words like that for her, not in anger, not in desperation, but in quiet, steady truth. The leader clenched his jaw and stepped off his horse. "Then you die," he hissed. He reached for his gun, and Mara could no longer stay inside. She pushed the cabin door open with a burst of desperate courage. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. Luke turned sharply, startled. "Mara?" "Get back inside," he said quickly, but she shook her head. Stepping forward with trembling legs, "No," she said. "Not again." The riders stared at her in surprise. She looked nothing like the broken captive they had dragged through the desert. She stood tall now, her chin high, her eyes burning with fire. "This man paid $3, she said loudly. "But he gave me something I never had." The leader sneered. "And what's that?" Mara pointed at Luke, her voice steady even as her heart raced. "He gave me my life back," she said. The men murmured uncertainly. Thrown off by her sudden strength, Mara stepped closer to Luke, standing beside him instead of behind him. Her body still shook, but her voice did not. "I ran from you once," she said to the men. "I begged the earth to swallow me rather than fall into your hands again." She took a trembling breath. "But I'm not running anymore." Luke looked at her with a softness she had never seen directed at her before. He reached out and touched her arm gently. "Mara, you don't have to do this," he whispered. Mara shook her head. "Yes," she said, "I do." She turned back to the riders. "You have no claim over me," she said. "No right, no power, no ownership." Her voice grew stronger. "I choose my life." She looked at Luke, her eyes shining with new courage. "And I choose who I trust." Luke felt something inside him tighten and soften at the same time. The leader growled angrily. "Fine," he shouted. You both die then. He lifted his pistol, but Luke was faster. Before the leader even fired, Luke shot the gun out of his hand. The crack of the shot echoed across the valley. The leader cried out, falling to his knees. Gripping his wounded hand, the other riders panicked. They hadn't expected a fight, not one they could lose. Several turned their horses and fled into the plains. A few remained frozen, unsure what to do. Luke stood firm. His gun still aimed. "Leave," he ordered. "All of you." The remaining riders hesitated only a moment before galloping away in fear. Within seconds, the valley was empty except for the dust their horses left behind. Luke slowly lowered his gun, his breath deep and steady. Mara stared at the empty horizon, tears filling her eyes. She had survived. She had chosen her life, and this time she wasn't alone. She turned toward Luke, her voice trembling. You saved me again." Luke shook his head gently. "No," he said softly. "You saved yourself." Mara stepped closer, her hands shaking as she placed them over his. "I wanted to live," she whispered, for the first time in a long time. "I wanted to live." Luke looked into her eyes. "And you will," he said. "You're safe now." Mara leaned her forehead against his chest, her tears warm against the cool morning air. Luke wrapped his arms around her slowly. Giving her comfort without taking her strength, they stood there in the yard. Two broken souls who had found something neither expected, a reason to keep going. A place to belong, a future that wasn't shaped by fear. When she finally lifted her head, Mara whispered, "Luke, what happens now?" Luke brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. "Whatever life you choose," he said gently, "and if you want." "I'd walk that road with you," Mara breathed shakily. "I do want that," she said. More than anything, and in that quiet morning light, surrounded by dust, danger. And new beginnings, Mara finally chose life. She chose freedom, she chose herself, and she chose the man who believed she deserved all of it. Hand in hand, they walked toward the cabin, toward safety, toward peace. Toward a future she never thought she'd have, a future she now dared to hope for. One step at a time, with Luke beside her, always.